is mediation activities, and over on your right is mediation strategies, and we'll look at the different scales as we go through. So we have, this is a summary of what you've just seen, we have mediating a text, we have 7 scales, we have mediating concepts, we have 4 scales for that, mediating communication, 3 scales for that, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples from these different scales. I could give you gazillions of examples, but we'd be here till next week, and I'm sure you don't want that. Then we have mediating strategies. We have 3 scales for explaining a new concept, and 2 scales for simplifying the text. And I'll give you a bit more detail of each of those as we go through. Now again, I don't expect you to read this, I will zoom in a minute. What the CEFR and the companion volume, in this case the companion volume, very kindly does is it gives us the descriptors, but it also gives us an example of a task that could be used in a given domain for that particular descriptor. You may or may not be aware that the CEFR refers to the personal, public, occupational and educational domain. Obviously today we're focusing on educational, but we'll have a look at it in more detail. So these are the B1 and B1 plus descriptors for, in this case, facilitating communication in delicate situations and disagreements. We've all been there. So a B1 student should be able to, as it says there, demonstrate his or her understanding of the key issue in a disagreement on a topic familiar to them. Because if you remember from the old CEFR, B1 is on a topic that is familiar to them, and can make a simple request for confirmation and clarification. That's what we expect of a student who is in a position of having to facilitate communication in a delicate situation or when there's a disagreement. At B1, they can ask parties to explain their point of view and can respond briefly to those explanations. So we're going beyond just understanding the key issues to actually responding to the explanations, again, provided the topic is familiar. Okay, so that's important. So those are the levels that we're looking at. We've got personal and public, so these are examples of situations where you might need those descriptors in the personal and the public domains, and the occupational domain and the educational. So here, I think we can all understand this. The example is when dealing with everyday negative interactions between classmates. And I'm sure we've all been in the situation where people have come up to us and said, I can't work with this person because they always turn up late or they don't do their work or whatever. So this would be an example of a real life domain and a real life task that students would have to do. And now we have some way of measuring their competence in that. Okay, so let's have a look in detail. Mediating a text, we said there were 7 scales. These are the different scales, and I'm going to give 3 examples just to highlight how we can work with these. So we've got relaying specific information, explaining data, processing text, translating a text, note-taking, expressing a personal response to creative text, and analysis and criticism of text. Fairly, hopefully, clear or clearly identifiable with, in our case, the EAP domain. So this is from the C1 level. Those are the descriptors for processing text in speech or in writing at level C1. And you can see it's about summarising long, complex texts, interpreting the content appropriately and respecting the style and register of the original. So we know that if someone can do this, then they're at C1 level, and of course there are the descriptors for the other levels as well. I should point out, this is quite important because it's not a case of we're translating everything. It's not promoting just translation. Obviously translation is one area of mediation, but there are lots of different aspects to mediation, as we'll see. The languages, when it says language A and B, they could be the same language. They could be 2 registers of the same language, 2 varieties of the same language. They could be different languages, but they could be the same language. So it's not all about translating from language A to language B. And as it says there, in the former case, if they're two different languages or two varieties, then we need to say which languages. If they're the same language, we just remove the parts in brackets. So that's important to remember. Those of you that know me will know that I've been involved in an EAP series called On What, which has different books. It has reading, writing and critical thinking, and listening, speaking and critical thinking. And the idea behind the book is that we integrate those skills. So I've taken an example from the C1 level book here, and this is about synthesizing information. And again, we've already heard about synthesizing being an important critical thinking skill. The question that the students are facing is, what is creative thinking? Explain the current understanding of this concept by synthesizing information from different sources. So, synthesizing information, they have to go to the readings that they've had, read the information, make notes, and then use that information going forward. How does the CEFR help us? I don't know what happened to my stick here. It was fine yesterday. So apologies for my stick, that's got a mind of its own. But if we start down the bottom, we can see the real world task is summarising and synthesising. Standard EAP task that you might have to do. The curriculum content that we can get from the CEFR and also from materials is that we have to summarise information from written texts. Therefore, in terms of what we have to teach students, we have to teach them the ability to synthesise information. We have to teach them to compare and contrast, and we have to teach them signposting language as well. From that, we then get the test content, which is explaining a concept, synthesising information, so it could be a written task or a spoken task, that doesn't matter, and we're given the assessment criteria in the form of the descriptors. If we look at B1 level now, this is the B1 level for explaining data in graphs. So these are what we can expect of a student at B1 level. Again, we're looking at detailed information in diagrams in his or her fields of interest, because again, we're still staying with what they know. Lexical gaps may cause hesitation, there may be some imprecise formulation, and describing overall trends in simple diagrams. So again, this is an example of a B1 level task from the same series. In this case, students have to be able to interpret a graph. They've been given some text telling them, modelling how to do that. They're then asked to, oops, my arrows and circles have got their own mind too. They're then asked to work with a partner and answer some questions below the graph that helps them to understand the graph. So those are the features that they need to be able to do in order to mediate that information from the visual content to the written or spoken output. And this then feeds into our little target again. The real world domain is describing the graphs, or it could be a table, it could be a graphic, it could be anything like that, in a spoken format or a written format. We've got the curriculum content, which is the ability to understand, describe and interpret graphs, and then we have to teach them vocabulary and tenses for graphs, and the function of suggesting reasons why the changes might have happened. And that gives us then our test content, which is to describe a graph with the assessment criteria at the different levels, so that we know if this person can do this, then at this level, if the performance is this, that matches this descriptor, it's this level, and so on. Then we've got mediating concepts. I'm rushing through this because there's so much to talk about. I could be really here for a week. So we've got collaborating in a group or leading group work. We'll just look briefly at an example of managing interaction. So at B2 level, they're expected to organise and manage collaborative group work. They're supposed to be able to